The headlights sliced through the midnight rain, illuminating the trembling body of a wounded German shepherd. Tires screeched. A woman gasped, but then, silence. The car sped away, leaving behind a soul abandoned in the dark, pain etched in its amber eyes. The wind howled through the empty streets, twisting between the skeletal branches of trees and rattling forgotten street signs that creaked with every violent gust. The night was colder than it had been in weeks. The rain fell in relentless sheets, hammering against the pavement, turning the world into a wash of darkness and glistening silver reflections. It was the kind of night where most people sought refuge indoors, curled up in warmth, oblivious to the world outside. But out here, on the forgotten edge of the city, where the streetlights flickered and the roads stretched empty, a battered body lay still against the rain-slick pavement. The German shepherd's breath came in short, ragged bursts, his ribs expanding only slightly with every painful inhale. His pharynx thick, proud, the mark of a dog who had once known love was now matted with blood, streaked with mud, and soaked from the downpour. Each shallow breath sent a dull ache through his broken body, pain coiling around his ribs like a vice. His limbs twitched, though the strength to move had long since abandoned him. Somewhere deep in the fading recesses of his mind, memories drifted like specter-swarm hands scratching behind his ears, the scent of sun-warmed grass, a voice calling his name in a tone filled with affection. Home. He had once had a home, but that warmth had long since disappeared, replaced by the harsh indifference of the streets. The car that had struck him was long gone, its taillights vanishing into the void. He had heard it, the sharp intake of breath, the moment of hesitation. The driver had seen him, had paused just long enough for their conscience to whisper, to gnaw at the edges of their humanity. But then the decision had been made. The engine revved, the tires splashed through the rain, and the car disappeared into the night, leaving him alone, bleeding, forgotten. Pain clawed at him, urging him to stay awake, to fight, but it was growing distant now. His eyelids, heavy with exhaustion, began to slip shut. The cold seeped deeper, numbing the agony until all that remained was a quiet stillness. Was this how it ended? The city around him continued, indifferent. Laughter echoed from a distant alley, the hum of engines droned along the main road, and somewhere life went on. But here, on this stretch of abandoned road, time stood still. And then footsteps. Soft at first, nearly lost in the chorus of the storm, but they grew louder, the sound of boots splashing through the puddles, slow, hesitant. Someone was coming. Noah Lancaster walked with his hands buried deep in the pockets of his worn-out jacket, his shoulders hunched against the storm's fury. His boots, their soles worn thin from too many restless nights wandering aimlessly, splashed through the shallow pools of rain. He wasn't supposed to be here. Then again, he wasn't supposed to be anywhere. The city felt unfamiliar, though it had once been home. He had left this place behind years ago, walking away from a life that had unraveled in his hands like loose thread. The ghosts of old mistakes still clung to him, whispering through the alleys, lurking in the shadows of every street corner. He had come back, though he wasn't sure why. Maybe he had nowhere else left to go. His steps faltered as he noticed the dark shape sprawled across the pavement. For a moment, his breath caught in his throat, his instincts bracing for the worst. But then, the faintest movement, a shallow rise and fall of the dog's chest. Noah hesitated. He should keep walking. This wasn't his problem. He had enough burdens of his own, enough regrets clawing at the edges of his consciousness. But something about the dog, the way it lay there, broken, abandoned, hit a part of him he had spent years trying to bury. He knelt down, his fingers trembling as they hovered above the dog's battered body. Even through the rain, he could see the deep gashes along its side, the way one of its legs lay at an unnatural angle. Blood seeped into the cracks of the pavement, diluted by the downpour but still there, staining the night in silent suffering. "Hey, buddy," he murmured, his voice barely audible over the storm. The German shepherd's ears twitched, a flicker of life, a fragile ember refusing to die. Noah exhaled slowly, the decision solidifying in his mind before he even realized he had made it. He knew what it was like to be left behind, to be discarded when the weight of your existence became inconvenient. He had spent years convincing himself that no one would come for him, that the world had moved on. But standing here, in the middle of this cold, empty street, looking at the wounded dog struggling to breathe. He knew one thing for certain. He couldn't leave it behind. With careful hands, he shrugged off his jacket, draping it over the trembling body. The warmth of the fabric was a poor shield against the storm, but it was something, a promise. "I've got you," he whispered, more to himself than to the dog. The storm raged on, but Noah didn't move. He sat there, kneeling on the rain-soaked pavement, waiting. For what, he wasn't sure. All he knew was that, for the first time in years, he wasn't walking away. Noah's hands trembled as he adjusted his jacket over the dog's shivering frame. The German Shepherd barely reacted, its body too weak to resist. Rain pooled in the cracks of the pavement, mixing with the streaks of blood that trailed from the animal's battered form. Every inch of the dog's fur was soaked, its ribs visible beneath the matted coat. Noah swallowed hard. The rational part of his mind told him to call for help to find a shelter, a rescue, someone better equipped to handle this. But another part of him, the one that had long been familiar with abandonment, knew the truth. No one would come. Not for him, not for the dog. His fingers twitched over his phone, but he hesitated. What if they put the dog down? A creature too broken to heal, too much of a burden to save. The thought made his chest tighten. The dog let out a small whimper, barely a sound, barely a plea. Noah exhaled sharply. "Okay," he muttered, more to himself than the animal. "Okay, let's get you out of here." He moved carefully, bracing for resistance, but the shepherd barely stirred as he slid his arms underneath it. The moment he lifted the dog, a sharp, broken cry ripped from its throat. The sound sent a jolt of pain through Noah's ribs, as if the agony belonged to him. "I know, buddy," he murmured, cradling the animal as best as he could. "I know it hurts." The storm continued, relentless and unyielding. Rain ran down Noah's face, dripping from his soaked hair. He could feel the cold biting through his clothes, but he kept moving. His small, run-down apartment was 10 blocks away, not far, but under these circumstances, it might as well have been miles. His arms ached with every step. The dog wasn't light, despite its malnourished frame. Every now and then, the shepherd whimpered, its head shifting slightly against Noah's chest, as if it were fighting to stay conscious. "Just a little further," Noah whispered, his breath ragged. The streets were empty at this hour. The occasional car passed, its headlights cutting through the rain, but no one stopped. The world moved on, as it always did. By the time Noah reached his apartment building, his legs were shaking. His soaked boots squelched against the stairs as he climbed to the second floor, maneuvering carefully to keep from jostling the dog too much. His fingers fumbled with the keys, numb from the cold, but finally, the lock clicked open. He pushed the door inward with his shoulder, stepping into the dimly lit space. His apartment was small bare walls, a sagging couch, and a cluttered kitchen table. He hadn't expected company. Carefully, he knelt and placed the dog down on an old blanket near the couch. The shepherd let out a soft groan, its body twitching from exhaustion. Noah moved quickly. He rummaged through his cabinets, searching for something that could help. A first aid kit, a clean towel. He wasn't a vet, but he'd been through enough rough nights to know the basics of patching wounds. His hands worked instinctively, gently dabbing at the worst of the cuts, wiping away dirt and blood. The dog flinched at first but soon went still, too weak to resist. "You're gonna be okay," Noah said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I promise." The words felt strange on his tongue. Promises were fragile things, easy to break. He had learned that the hard way. He sat beside the dog for a long time, watching its shallow breaths, listening to the storm beyond the window. The weight of the night pressed against his bones. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but for now, in this moment, he had made a choice. He wasn't leaving this dog behind. The morning came slowly, bleeding into the dark apartment with a pale gray light. The rain had finally ceased, leaving behind only the occasional drip of water from the rusted gutter outside. Noah's body ached as he shifted on the couch, his muscles stiff from sleeping in an awkward position. He hadn't meant to fall asleep. He had only meant to rest his eyes for a moment, just long enough to make sure the shepherd's breathing remained steady. With a groggy exhale, he sat up, rubbing his face. His clothes were still damp, his skin sticky from the night before. But the first thing he noticed wasn't himself, it was the dog. The German shepherd had barely moved, but its amber eyes were open now, blinking sluggishly in the dim light. Noah's chest tightened. "Hey," he said softly. The dog didn't respond. It only watched him, as if trying to decide whether he was friend or foe. Its body was still tense, every breath a struggle, but there was something in those eyes, something different from last night. A spark, a will to live. Noah reached for the water bowl he had placed beside the blanket. It wasn't much, just an old plastic dish filled with clean water. He nudged it slightly closer. "You thirsty?" he asked. For a moment, the shepherd didn't move. Then, with slow, hesitant effort, it shifted its front paw, dragging itself an inch closer. The movement was labored, but it was something. Noah held his breath as the dog dipped its muzzle forward, lapping weakly at the water. "That's it," Noah murmured. "Take it slow." He wasn't sure how long he sat there, just watching the dog drink. Time blurred in moments like these, quiet, fragile moments where nothing else seemed to matter. When the shepherd finally stopped, its eyes lifted back to Noah's. There was still pain there, still exhaustion, but there was also something else. Trust. Noah exhaled, feeling something uncoil in his chest. He hadn't expected this, not the weight of responsibility, not the strange, unspoken bond forming between them. He reached out, slow and careful, his fingers hovering just above the shepherd's damp fur. The dog flinched but didn't pull away. "You've been through hell, huh?" Noah murmured. The shepherd didn't answer, but then again, it didn't need to. Noah ran a hand through his already messy hair, letting out a breathless chuckle. "Guess that makes two of us." The day stretched on, slow and quiet. Noah didn't leave the apartment. He wasn't sure he could. The idea of stepping outside, of leaving the dog alone, felt wrong. Instead, he busied himself with small tasks, cleaning up the space, searching his fridge for anything remotely dog-friendly. He had never owned a pet before, but he figured a little food couldn't hurt. The shepherd remained still for most of the day, only moving occasionally to shift positions. Every time it tried, a soft whimper would escape its throat, a sound that made Noah's stomach twist. He didn't know what he was doing. He didn't know if he was helping or just prolonging the inevitable. But when the shepherd finally lifted its head enough to rest against his knee, something inside him cracked. For the first time in years, he felt something other than numbness. Hope. The days passed in a blur of careful movements, quiet observations, and hesitant steps toward healing. The German shepherd whom Noah had started calling Shadow was slow to recover. Every attempt to move was met with pain. Every effort to stand ended in collapse. But he tried. That was what mattered. Noah wasn't sure why he cared so much. He had told himself that the dog wasn't his responsibility, that once Shadow was strong enough, he'd find a shelter or someone more equipped to help. But each time he looked into those amber eyes, he knew he was lying to himself. The bond between them had formed in the silent hours of the night, in the whispered reassurances, in the moments where Noah would wake to find Shadow watching him from his spot on the blanket, as if trying to make sense of the man who had refused to leave him behind. "You're stubborn," Noah muttered one evening, watching as Shadow made another attempt to push himself up onto shaky legs. "I respect that." Shadow let out a soft grunt, his body trembling with effort before he collapsed back onto the blanket. Noah sighed. "We'll try again tomorrow." But tomorrow came with complications Noah hadn't expected. It started with a knock at the door. Noah tensed instantly. No one visited him. No one even knew he was back in the city, at least. No one who should. Shadow let out a low, weak growl, his ears flicking toward the door. It was the first real noise of protest Noah had heard from him, and it sent a chill down his spine. Rising to his feet, he crossed the small apartment and peered through the peephole. A woman stood outside. Blonde hair, expensive coat, perfectly painted lips curved into a tight, unreadable expression. Noah's heart stopped. Claire. His past had found him. For a long moment, he couldn't move. He had spent years avoiding her, avoiding everything she represented. But now she was here, standing just beyond the threshold of the life he had barely started to rebuild. She knocked again, louder this time. "Noah, I know you're in there." His jaw clenched. There was no way out of this. Slowly, he unlocked the door and pulled it open. Claire's gaze swept over him, her blue eyes sharp as ever. She took in the unkempt apartment, the tired lines on his face, the unmistakable scent of rain-soaked fur lingering in the air. "You look like hell," she said. Noah exhaled. You always knew how to flatter a guy." Her lips pressed into a thin line. "Can I come in?" He hesitated, then stepped aside. The moment she crossed the threshold, the atmosphere in the room shifted. The ghosts of old conversations, old arguments, old wounds filled the space between them. She glanced down and froze. Noah followed her gaze to where Shadow lay on the blanket, his weak body curled tightly as he watched her with wary, intelligent eyes. "You have a dog now?" Claire asked, her voice softer than before. Noah ran a hand through his hair. "Not exactly." Something in her expression changed. A flicker of emotion, something Noah couldn't quite place. "Is this about him?" she asked quietly. Noah didn't answer. He didn't need to. Claire let out a slow breath. "You're still trying to fix things you can't fix." Noah's fists tightened at his sides. "Why are you here, Claire?" She hesitated. For the first time since she had arrived, she looked uncertain, vulnerable. "There's something you need to know," she said. "Something about the woman who hit that dog." Noah's blood ran cold. He hadn't spoken about the accident to anyone. The only people who knew about Shadow's condition were the ones who had chosen to ignore it. So how did Claire know? "Start talking," he said, his voice dangerously low. Claire didn't flinch. "The woman who hit that dog, her name is Victoria Monroe." The name sent a jolt through Noah's chest. He had heard it before. Everyone had. Victoria Monroe wasn't just anyone. She was a millionaire, heir to a real estate empire, a woman whose face graced magazine covers and charity events, a person who lived in a world so far removed from Noah's own that he had never imagined their paths would cross. Until now. "Why does this matter?" he asked, his voice tight. Claire folded her arms. Because she didn't just hit that dog and drive away. She knew what she had done, and she didn't care. Noah felt his pulse hammering in his ears. "You're saying she left him there on purpose?" Claire nodded. She was coming from a party that night. There were witnesses. People saw the accident, but no one spoke up. You know how it works, money makes problems disappear. She didn't even stop long enough to check if he was alive. Noah's jaw clenched so hard it hurt. He turned to look at Shadow, the dog's tired eyes still watching him, oblivious to the weight of the conversation happening around him. His entire body burned with quiet rage. "Why are you telling me this?" he asked finally. Claire hesitated. "Because I know you, Noah. I know you won't let this go." She was right. Noah had spent his life running from his past, from his mistakes, from the things he couldn't change. But this was different. Victoria Monroe had left Shadow to die. And Noah wasn't going to let her walk away from it. The room was thick with silence. Claire shifted uncomfortably. "Look, I know you don't trust me, but I thought you should know. Do whatever you want with the information." She moved toward the door. "Claire." She paused. Noah exhaled, the weight of the moment pressing down on his chest. "Thanks." She gave him a small, almost sad smile. "Be careful, Noah. People like her. They don't lose." The door clicked shut behind her. Noah stood there for a long moment, staring at the empty space where Claire had been. Shadow let out a soft whimper, shifting slightly on the blanket. Noah knelt beside him, his fingers running gently over the shepherd's damp fur. "We're not walking away from this," he murmured. "Not this time." Shadow didn't move, but his amber eyes burned with something new. And for the first time since that night, Noah felt the fire return to his own. The city stretched before Noah like a vast, unfeeling machine. From the rooftop of his apartment complex, he could see the endless sprawl of lights blinking in the distance, a sea of movement that never stopped, never noticed. It had been 3 days since Claire's visit. 3 days since he learned the truth about Victoria Monroe. 3 days since he decided he wasn't going to let this go. But now, as the weight of it all pressed against his chest, doubt crept in like a slow-moving shadow. What was he going to do? March up to one of the most powerful women in the city and demand justice for a dog? He could already hear the laughter, the condescension, the doors slamming in his face. People like Victoria Monroe didn't face consequences. People like him? They were the ones who got crushed. A gust of wind cut through his damp clothes, sending a shiver down his spine. His fingers curled around the railing, gripping it so tightly his knuckles turned white. His mind was a battlefield rage clashing with helplessness, determination warring with the bitter truth. He had spent years convincing himself that the world was indifferent, that there was no point in fighting battles he couldn't win. He had left this city once because of that very belief. And yet, here he was, standing in the cold, staring at the skyline like it held answers he couldn't find within himself. Behind him, the sound of slow, shuffling steps pulled him from his thoughts. Noah turned. Shadow stood just outside the open door, his legs shaky, his body still bruised and weak, but standing nonetheless. His amber eyes met Noah's, unblinking, unwavering. Something inside Noah cracked. He walked over, kneeling beside the shepherd, careful not to touch the still healing wounds. "You're not supposed to be walking yet," he murmured. Shadow let out a slow exhale, the rise and fall of his chest steady, determined. Noah sighed, resting his forearms on his knees. "Yeah," he muttered. "I guess we're both too stubborn for our own good." The night was still, save for the distant hum of the city below. The world carried on as it always died, uncaring, unchanging. But Noah wasn't the same man he had been when he returned. He wasn't the same man who had walked past suffering, convincing himself it wasn't his problem. He wasn't the same man who had once chosen to run. Noah reached out slowly, letting his fingers brush against Shadow's fur. The dog didn't flinch this time. Instead, he leaned into the touch, just slightly, just enough. "We're going to do something about this," Noah whispered, "even if it kills us." Shadow didn't answer, but he didn't have to. The night stretched on, and somewhere in the distance, thunder rumbled, a storm brewing on the horizon. And this time, Noah wasn't going to turn away. The hours slipped away as Noah sat on the rooftop, lost in thought. The city below pulsed with life, a stark contrast to the weight settling in his chest. He was running out of time. He knew that. Victoria Monroe wouldn't remember the night she hit Shadow. She wouldn't care. People like her moved on from their sins without a second thought. But Noah couldn't. His fingers curled into a fist as he exhaled sharply, the cold night air burning his lungs. His mind kept circling the same thought: what could he possibly do? He had no power, no influence. He was just a man trying to pick up the pieces of a life he had long since broken. Maybe Claire was right. Maybe this was just another battle he couldn't win. Shadow shifted beside him, his tired body sinking onto the concrete. His breathing was slow but steady. He had fought so hard to live. And for what? To be forgotten again. Noah ran a hand through his hair. "This isn't fair," he muttered. He didn't know if he was talking to Shadow or himself. The wind picked up, howling through the alleys below. A storm was coming. The scent of rain clung to the air, heavy and electric. Noah let out a bitter laugh. "Figures," he muttered. "Even the weather's against us." Shadow let out a low huff, shifting closer to Noah's side. Noah closed his eyes, his thoughts tumbling over each other, tangled and chaotic. This wasn't just about the dog anymore. It was about every time he had walked away. Every time he had told himself that fighting back wasn't worth it. Every time he had let the world tell him that people like him didn't matter. Maybe it wasn't about winning. Maybe it was about refusing to be silent. His eyes opened, the fire in his chest sparking back to life. Noah looked down at Shadow, who was still watching him, still trusting him. "We don't run anymore," Noah whispered. The words felt foreign on his tongue, but they tasted right. The storm rolled in, the first drops of rain splattering against the rooftop. Noah didn't move. Neither did Shadow. They sat together, waiting for the dawn. Noah had spent the last few years as a ghost, drifting, watching, but never truly living. But as he stood outside Victoria Monroe's estate, hidden in the shadows of the towering wrought iron gates, he felt something different. Purpose. The rain had stopped, leaving the night air thick with humidity. The estate loomed ahead, a mansion draped in wealth and indifference. It sat on the edge of the city, nestled behind security fences, as if shielding itself from the world it quietly stepped on. Noah clenched his fists. People like Victoria Monroe never thought about the damage they left in their wake. To them, suffering was just an inconvenience, a momentary flicker of discomfort before they turned the page and moved on. But Shadow wasn't a forgotten accident. He wasn't roadkill left behind on the pavement. He was here, alive. And so was Noah. From the passenger seat of the truck, Shadow let out a quiet exhale. He was still weak, his ribs showing beneath his recovering frame, but his spirit had not dimmed. His amber eyes flickered to Noah, unwavering. Noah exhaled. "We're really doing this, huh?" Shadow didn't answer, but Noah didn't expect him to. With one last glance toward the mansion, Noah pulled out his phone. He had spent the last 2 days gathering everything he could security footage from a nearby store that had caught the edge of Victoria's car speeding away. Accounts from witnesses who had seen the accident, but had been too afraid to speak. He had names, faces, evidence. And now, it was time to use it. His thumb hovered over Claire's number. She had warned him. Victoria Monroe doesn't lose. Noah gritted his teeth. Maybe that had been true before. Maybe she had spent years brushing her mistakes under the rug, silencing anyone who dared to challenge her. But this time, she had left something behind. A survivor. Noah hit call. It rang twice before Claire answered. Noah. Her voice was tight, uneasy. "I need you to get a message to her," he said, cutting straight to the point. "Tell Victoria Monroe that I know what she did, and if she doesn't fix it, I will." A heavy silence filled the line. "Noah," Claire sighed, "you don't know what you're getting yourself into." "You're right," he admitted. "I don't, but I know this. She's not walking away from this one." Claire hesitated, and for a moment he thought she might refuse. But then, she exhaled. "I'll pass the message," she said. "But Noah, be careful." The call ended. Noah tightened his grip on the steering wheel. His pulse was steady, his mind clear. For the first time in years, he wasn't running. He was standing his ground. Victoria Monroe did not appreciate being threatened. Noah had expected silence. He had expected her to ignore him, to pretend like he didn't exist. Instead, she responded faster than he anticipated. 24 hours after he made the call, she sent someone to deliver her message. Noah wasn't surprised. He had been watching the street from his window when the black SUV pulled up in front of his apartment. The man who stepped out was exactly the type Noah had expected: suit, cold eyes, the kind of person who didn't ask questions. Noah met him in the alley behind the building. Shadow stayed inside, watching from the window, his ears twitching with unease. The man stopped a few feet away, adjusting his cuffs like this was just another job. "Miss Monroe has no interest in entertaining your threats," he said smoothly. "But she's willing to compensate you for your trouble." Noah tilted his head. "Let me guess. A check and a warning to keep my mouth shut." The man smiled. "You're smarter than you look." Noah let out a dry laugh. "Tell Victoria she can keep her money. I don't want a payoff." The man sighed, rubbing his temple like Noah was an inconvenience. "That's a shame. It would be easier for everyone if you just took the deal." Noah's expression darkened. "Easier for her, you mean?" The man's smile thinned. "You don't want to make an enemy of her." "I already have," Noah said, stepping closer, "and I don't care." For the first time, the man's confidence wavered. He studied Noah for a long moment, as if trying to decide whether he was bluffing. Noah wasn't. Finally, the man's smirk returned, but it was thinner now, stretched over something wary. "Suit yourself," he muttered, stepping back toward the SUV. "But don't say you weren't warned." The car pulled away, its taillights disappearing into the city. Noah stood there for a long time, the weight of the moment settling over him. He had made his choice. There was no turning back now. Inside, Shadow waited, his amber eyes locked onto Noah the second he walked through the door. Noah let out a slow breath, kneeling beside the dog. "Guess we pissed off the wrong people." Shadow didn't react. He just watched, as if waiting. Noah exhaled. "Don't worry, buddy," he murmured, resting his hand on Shadow's head. "We're not done yet." Because Victoria Monroe had made a mistake. She thought she could scare him into silence. She thought he was just another problem to be paid off and erased. But she was wrong. Noah wasn't going away. And neither was the truth. The city felt different now. Not quieter, not softer, but different. Noah had spent years walking these streets like a ghost, unseen and unnoticed. But tonight, he felt the weight of every step, the reality of every breath. He wasn't a ghost anymore, he was here. And he wasn't backing down. He stood outside the news station, his hands shoved deep in the pockets of his jacket. The USB drive felt heavier than it should, its weight pressing into his palm like a loaded weapon. On it were the security footage, the witness statements, and the undeniable truth of what Victoria Monroe had done. It had taken days of persistence. Some witnesses had been hesitant, afraid of getting involved. Others had been indifferent. But Noah had found enough to prove that Shadow's suffering hadn't been an accident. Enough to make sure the world knew the kind of person Victoria Monroe really was. The station doors loomed ahead, glass reflecting the city lights. This was it, the final step. Noah exhaled, his fingers tightened around the USB. A soft nudge at his leg made him glance down. Shadow sat beside him, his body still thin but stronger now, his coat growing thick again, his eyes burning with the same quiet determination that Noah had come to rely on. "You ready for this?" Noah murmured. Shadow didn't move, but he didn't look away either. Noah let out a small chuckle. "Yeah," he muttered, "me neither." But they didn't have a choice. Taking a steadying breath, Noah stepped forward and pushed open the doors. The newsroom was exactly what he had expected, bright, sterile, filled with the hum of conversations and ringing phones. He could feel the weight of the stairs as he walked toward the front desk, Shadow staying close by his side. The receptionist barely looked up. "Can I help you?" Noah pulled the USB from his pocket and set it on the counter. "I have a story for you." She raised an eyebrow, finally looking up. "We don't just take random. It's about Victoria Monroe." That got her attention. Minutes later, he was seated in a small office across from a journalist named Daniel Hayes. The man looked skeptical but interested, fingers drumming against the desk as he listened to Noah lay everything out. The accident, the footage, the silence that followed, and the truth. By the time Noah finished, Daniel was staring at the USB like it might explode. "You're sure about this?" he asked. Noah nodded. "Every word." Daniel hesitated, then leaned back in his chair. "If this is legit, it's gonna blow up. Monroe's got half the city in her pocket. You realize what you're walking into?" Noah exhaled. "Yeah. And you're still doing it?" Noah glanced at Shadow. The dog sat near the door, his ears twitching slightly, his gaze fixed on Noah. Noah looked back at Daniel. "Yeah," he said again, firmer this time. Daniel studied him for a long moment, then let out a low whistle. "All right," he muttered. "Let's see what happens." The fallout was immediate. The story aired the next night, complete with video evidence and interviews from the few witnesses who had agreed to speak on record. Within hours, it was everywhere: social media, news stations, even radio broadcasts. Victoria Monroe had hit a dog with her car. She had left it for dead, and she had tried to silence the truth. But now, the world knew. Noah watched it unfold from his apartment, Shadow curled up beside him. He could hear the anchors discussing it, speculating on Monroe's response, on the legal implications, on whether or not this would finally be the scandal that brought her down. For the first time in years, Noah felt something unfamiliar. Relief. He had done something that mattered. Shadow let out a soft huff, shifting against Noah's side. "We did it," Noah murmured, running a hand over the dog's fur. "Told you we weren't walking away from this." Shadow sighed, resting his head on Noah's knee. Outside, the city moved on, as it always did. But this time, it had changed. And so had they. Some battles aren't about winning, they're about refusing to stay silent. Noah stood up for the one who couldn't speak, and in doing so, he proved that even the smallest voice can shake the powerful. How many times have we walked past something wrong, convincing ourselves it wasn't our fight? Maybe it's time to stop walking. Maybe it's time to stand. If this story moved you, share it. Let's make sure no one else gets left behind. Like, comment, and subscribe, because every voice matters. And sometimes the smallest act of kindness can change a life forever.